Thank you for purchasing a DF4900 linear bearing Smith machine by Deltech Fitness. Your 4900 will come in 4 boxes. In the first box, you will have left hand and right hand uprights, hook catch rods, and 2 long and short flanges. The second box will contain your top frame, feet, cross member, shoes, instructions, hardware, triangle flanges, bumpers, Allen wrenches, and a sticker. Box 3 will contain your hook bar and a cardboard tube containing guide rods. Finally, Box 4 will contain 4 boxes and the rear supports. In the 4 boxes you have rod collars, safety catches, Smith bar collars, springs, weight sleeves, weight collars, weight plate holders, and weight bumpers. The first thing we need to do is loosen up the rubber shoes before we put them on. On the feet, there's a square boss with a hole in it welded to the top of the tube. The shoes have a long flat bottom, so make sure that the flat bottom faces the opposite side of the boss. I found that it's easier to slide the 3 thin sides of the boot over the tube, then pull the thick bottom of the boot over the edge while pushing it onto the tube. If you want to make sure these shoes never come off, some customers use glue in the shoe before installing it. With all 4 boots on the feet, it's time to lay out the bottom of the frame of the Smith machine. Make sure that the square bosses go toward the outside of the Smith machine. The bosses will also be the front of the machine. Lay both tubes about 4 feet apart, and then go grab the cross member. The cross member bolts to the back holes of the feet, so lay it in position and then straighten out the feet. With everything lined up, go and grab one of the rear supports. There's a left and right support, so you can tell which one is which by the angled flange on the bottom. The bottom of the angled flange seats against the outside of the tube. While holding the rear support in place, run in the rear M12 bolt first with a washer. With the rear bolt in, the rear support should hold itself when you go to thread in the front bolt. Use a washer on each side of the bolt and thread in the lock nuts. With the right side done, it's time to move on to the left. It's important to note that this powder coat is slippery, so be careful to not let the rear supports slip because they can do damage to the Smith machine or you if they fall. We wanted to show you an example of the correct way to assemble this frame. Notice how the bosses are on the outside of the machine. If they're on the inside, you have the left and right mixed up and you'll have to take the whole machine apart later to fix it. After you've verified that it has been assembled correctly, snug the back 2 bolts and leave the front ones loose so the rear supports can move up and down. Next, we're going to install the uprights. Just like the rear supports, there's a left and right side. The big holes on the upright should face inside the Smith machine, and the small holes should face toward the outside. Make sure that the holes are biased toward the front of the machine, and set the flange down on the foot tube with the bottom part of the flange facing the outside. Go ahead and thread 2 M12 bolts through the upright flange, through the foot, with a washer on each side. Cap them off with some lock nuts, making sure to hold the tube securely. For this step, you will be using the long flanges from box 1. Thread a bolt through a washer, into the long flange, through the upright, and out the other flange. Cap the bolts off with washers and nuts. Repeat the same process for the other side. Again, remember that this powder coat is slick and these uprights are very heavy. If you're completing this step by yourself, be careful and hold it tight. We recommend using 2 people, one to hold the upright in place as the other bolts it down. If you have trouble getting the bottom bolt started, try holding the nut in place and then trying to spin the bolt to get the nut started. With all 12 bolts in, go ahead and tighten them all down. They're a 19mm hex. These are all lock nuts, so tighten the bolt through the nylon insert in the nut. I'm using box end wrenches to complete this step, but it's much easier with a socket set or an impact gun. Now that the frame's tight, it's time to install the hook catch rods. Remove the bolt, lock washer, and washer from the catch rod, then push the threaded side through the large hole inside the upright. Thread the bolt, washer, and lock washer through the other side of the upright into the weight catch. Tighten it down with a wrench while holding the other side. The weight catches should lock themselves in place once they start to get tight, so make sure to give them an extra crank with a wrench or socket. If they spin in the hole, keep tightening. They will eventually catch and tighten down. Trust me. With the weight catches in and tight, it's time to install the weight plate holders. Grab the M10 bolts, weight holders, and large skinny rubber bumpers. Thread the bolts through a washer, through the holders, through the tube, and then through another washer before being capped off with a lock nut. These holders are very convenient while loading this machine, and even aid to dampen movement while the machine is in use. Tighten up the bolts with a 17mm wrench or socket, and then move on to the other side. Repeat the same steps for the other side, making sure to keep the weight holders straight on the rear supports. Next, grab the triangle flange and the short flange from box 1. Thread the bolt through a washer, through the flange, through the upright, into the triangle flange. Make sure the flange is pointing inside the machine. Once you get both bolts in, cap them off with washers and nuts. Repeat the same steps for the other side. Up until this point, I have assembled the machine by myself, but this step is too dangerous to try on your own. With a partner, grab the top frame assembly and 2 M12 bolts, nuts, and washers each. While one holds the frame, the other one can bolt the frame to the corner flange, and then switch. Make sure to only install the nuts hand tight for now. With the top frame assembly in place and all 4 bolts in, it's time to install the guide rods. This is also much easier with 2 people. Grab the guide rod and a rubber bumper and slide it into the boss on the foot. Slide the rubber bumper onto the rod. Next, grab a safety catch and a guide rod collar. These are both left and right hand parts. The flange of the safety catch should be biased toward the inside of the rack. The right guide rod collar should be identified easily by the extra dowel welded to it. Make sure that the dowel faces the inside of the rack and the flange goes toward the outside. Before installing the guide rod collar, slide a spring onto the guide rod. The linear bearings in the guide rod collar are what make this piece so special, so be careful to not force the bearings onto the guide rods. If you do end up damaging them or wearing them out over time, we have replacements available on our website. Repeat the same steps for the other side. Remember that the safety catch flange should bias toward the inside of the machine, and the flange on the guide rod collar should bias toward the outside. Guide rods fully loaded, lift up on the top frame and seat the guide rods into the bosses on the top frame. If the frame doesn't go all the way down onto the rods, you may have to take a small Allen wrench and loosen the set screws in the boss. With the helper holding the frame straight, tighten up the corner flange and then repeat for the other side. With everything tightened down, raise your safety catches to a comfortable working height. We've found that installing the hook bar after the guide rods is a much easier solution. Slide the hook bar behind the guide rods and hang it from the hooks on the rack. The openings of the hook should go toward the back of the rack. With the hook bar in place, we can assemble the weight carriage. Grab the Smith bar collars. The flanges on the collar should face the front of the rack and the outside of the rack. Many people install these backwards and the machine doesn't function correctly. Make sure that the tube on the bar collar is faced toward the inside of the rack. With the bar collar in place, lift up the rod collar and thread an M10 bolt through a washer, then through the bar collar flange, then the rod collar flange, then a washer and a nut. Make sure that the bar collar is on the outside. Turn the bar collar until the holes line up, then install the other 3 nuts and bolts. Once all 4 bolts are in, move on to the other side. Again, make sure that the bar collar faces the inside of the rack. If you go to install your weight sleeves and they don't go on all the way, look at your bar collars. They might be backwards. While this step is made easier with a socket wrench with an extension, I use some 17mm box end wrenches to tighten down all the nuts and bolts on the bar collar assemblies. We're in the home stretch, so it's time to bolt on the weight sleeves. The weight sleeves should have been packaged with the special bolts that go with them. We've provided the correct size Allen wrench to tighten these bolts. Slide the weight sleeves onto the bar. There are several grooves in the bar, so make sure it is all the way seated before threading on the bolt. The weight sleeve should end up very close to the bar collar, within about 1/8 of an inch or so. Go ahead and attach the other side. Watch as I slide the bar through all the grooves in the weight sleeve. If the weight sleeve is not straight, you will not be able to fully seat it on the bar. Thread in the bolt, and then tighten it down with the Allen wrench. To adjust the guide rods, hang the weight bar from the top catch hook rod, and grab the small Allen wrench provided. Use the small end of the Allen wrench to tighten a set screw until it just barely touches the guide rod. Then tighten down the other set screw with the large end. Repeat the same steps for the other side. You don't want to move the guide rod, so if you do, back off the set screw and then tighten the other side. Put the safety catches on the rubber bumpers, then slide the weight bar all the way down the guide rods. Repeat the same steps for the bottom that you did for the top. At this point, your Smith machine is ready for use. Go ahead and raise up the bar and the safety catches to a comfortable working height. We included some collars for safe lifting. Our Smith machine is large enough to where you can squat or bench in either direction, depending on what feels comfortable for your wrists. If you would like to add on to your Smith machine, check out our DF830 and DF838 lat row attachments. The DF4900 is a tank built to last forever, and with a company supplying service parts that has been around for over 20 years, you will always be able to get them. Thanks again for choosing Deltech Fitness.